All right, so assuming everyone has joined the room, hello everyone, and welcome to the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership, or CAPAL's Washington Leadership Program. My name is Dakota Picurdi, and I'm on the board of directors for CAPAL and also head of its community engagement task force. So the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership is a nonprofit organization that builds Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, or NHPI, public service leaders by providing formative professional experiences and growth opportunities. It is my pleasure to be introducing our Washington Leadership Program with you today. WLP is one of our signature programs that introduces students to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander leaders in public service who can inform and inspire students' own civic engagement. Our WLP theme this year is Reflection and Resiliency, emphasizing the ability of communities to come together and catalyze momentous change through these unforeseen times. Through these sessions, panelists and attendees will reflect upon events leading up to 2021, emphasizing how communities unite to reflect and demonstrate unyielding tenacity and resilience, even in the face of uncertain and demanding circumstances. All WLP sessions will be recorded and live streamed to our Facebook page and will be available for later viewing afterwards, including materials. I would like to welcome you to today's session, What is Your Experience with America? Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. This session includes, and sorry, 1 second here, technical difficulties, of course. And yes, so this session will address the experience of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in the US, acknowledging pivotal moments, challenges, and ongoing developments across generations, cultures, and communities. Key topics will include the effects of colonization, generational trauma, identity building, and methods of advocacy and empowerment in today's landscape. Follow and join our conversation tonight on social media using the hashtag WeAreCapal and tag us at CapalDC. There will also be a short survey that will pop up after we close the session, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback through this survey. With that said, I would like to begin by thanking our speakers and panelists this evening for spending time with us, and to you all for joining in. And a very special thank you to our 2021 sponsors and for making programs like tonight's possible at CAPAL. Tonight's program will consist of a poll activity, panel discussion, and Q&A. Please submit any questions you have into the Q&A box and we'll close out afterwards. Now, I'm very pleased to pass it to Hannah Park, our wonderful associate, to set the stage for our panel with a poll activity. Hannah, over to you.
All right, so thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Dakota. Good evening, everybody. My name is Hannah Park, and I am the Programs and Operations Associate at CAPAL. Big thank you to everybody for tuning into our 6th Washington Leadership Program session tonight. So before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to open up with a quick poll for the audience, which I will launch shortly. These poll questions were actually submitted by our panelists, and they are intended to provide a gauge and also to introduce some of the topics that we will be covering tonight. I will say, if you are unsure about the answer to a question while you're filling it out, that's totally fine. Feel free to go with your intuition or your best guess. All right, so the poll is up and ready to go. So I will pause here if folks in the audience would like to take a few minutes to fill out the poll, and then I will go ahead and share the results. All right, so I think most of the folks have filled out the poll, so I'm going to go ahead and close it out. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results now. So it seems like for the first question, true or false, the US affiliated Pacific Islands occupy exclusive economic zones twice as large as the continental US. 85% of the audience chose true for that one, with 15% choosing false. For the second question, true or false, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are overrepresented in the military. So 62% said false, while 38%, I believe, said true. And then finally, true or false, most Chamorros live in Guam. 73% said false, while 27% said true, which is interesting. So with these sort of results and trends in mind, I will actually hand it over to our panelist, Javon Santos, who actually drew up these questions and has really insightful information to share regarding the answers to these questions. So Javon, I will hand it over to you.
Hi guys, I just wanted to say thanks to CAPAL for inviting me. My name is Javon Santos, and I'm born and raised in Guam, and I'm a former CAPAL alum, but I'm here to talk about the questions, so let's get started. True or false, the US affiliated Pacific Islands occupy exclusive economic zones twice as large as the continental US. The correct answer is actually false. The answer is that the US affiliated Pacific Islands occupy EEZs 4 times as large as the continental US. And I thought this was an important fun fact because whenever people think of the Pacific Islands, they might think of smaller islands and, you know, smaller area, but the Pacific is so vast and so large and has a lot of resources and values beyond the landmass of our islands. Our economic zones, just the US affiliated ones, are larger than the US 4 times over. So when thinking about how the US is involved in the Pacific, it's important to think about what's in stake for them and what is the benefits to them. And economic zones and resources are one thing that we have to think about. The next question, true or false, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are overrepresented in the military? Many answered false, but the answer is true. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, they are enlisting in the military, according to a study done in 2005, enlisted in the military at a rate of 250% higher than the national average. So when thinking about why these Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are going into the military, we have to think about what is in their homelands, what is in their islands, and what brings them to see the military as their best option for their futures. And the last question, true or false, most Chamorros live in Guam. You guys got that correct. The answer is false. There are more Chamorros living outside of the Marianas Islands, the native homeland of the Chamorros. More Chamorros live in the United States than in the Marianas Islands, the homeland. So when we talk about Pacific Islander issues, one of the issues that plague the Pacific Islander community is displacement, and thinking about what makes Pacific Islanders leave their native islands and their homelands and their communities is something that I wanted to get started, just putting that into perspective, that there's more Chamorros in the continental US than there is in the United States, the US states, including Hawaii, than there is in their homeland in Guam. So those are the true or false polls. I hope that gave the people attending some perspective on the Pacific Islander community. And I'll turn it back over to Hannah. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Javon, so much for illuminating those really insightful answers. I know that when I was going through those questions, like this was all information that was very new to me, which I think goes to show how important it is to have these types of discussions around these issues today. So big thank you to our panelists for submitting very insightful and also surprising to some information. Feel free to compare these results with your own as well. So that about wraps up our poll activity. So thank you to everyone for participating. Hopefully you all learned something new or was introduced to a new topic tonight. So with that being said, I will now hand it off back to Dakota.
All right, thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you, Javon, for getting us started on those really interesting facts. I did not know, I think, the correct answers for any of those. So just goes to show how much we have to learn from this panel, and I'm really excited to hear more from our amazing panelists. And so now, without further ado, the moment you've all been waiting for, please give a warm welcome to Representative Patrick Branco, who will be leading who will be our moderator for this panel. Patrick will be leading the discussion and the Q&A. So Representative Patrick Bihana Branco is proud to serve as a state representative for District 50, which is Kailua and Kaneohe Bay. And he is the vice chair of the Water and Land Committee and is also a member of the Finance as well as the Corrections, Military, and Veterans Committees. Drawn to public service, he joined the US Foreign Service as a diplomat in 2012, serving tours in Colombia, Pakistan, the Office of Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Secretary of State's Operations Center, and Venezuela. Representative Branco is a fourth generation Kailua resident, and he is also a graduate of the Kamehameha Schools, Hawaii Pacific University, and Johns Hopkins University. And fun fact, last but not least, Patrick is also a CAPAL board alumnus for 2018-2019. And currently is, since obviously he's still alive, the first Native Hawaiian board member in CAPAL's history. So Patrick, we are so excited to have you here moderating our discussion tonight and excited to have you back with CAPAL. So now handing it off to you.
Thank you, Dakota. I appreciate that. I'm very happy to be here. And let's go ahead and take a moment to introduce our panelists. So the first, Michelle, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you, CAPAL, and everyone here for joining and having me here. My name is Michelle Pedro, and I am the Policy Director and Communication Specialist for Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese. And I'm just very honored and feel very blessed to be here.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's go ahead to Maka, my high school classmate, actually. It's great to see him on here.
Aloha kako. Ai o wau no o Maka. I am Maka. He kupa no wau no ka aina kaulana o Waialua. I'm a native Hawaiian of the famous lands of the North Shore of Waialua. I'm currently a brand manager with the state of Hawaii, Hawaii Tourism Authority, but I come here to share my personal experiences, my beliefs and opinions of myself and my experiences. I am a Native Hawaiian practitioner on the North Shore, and I also graduated from Kamehameha Schools, as well as the University of Hawaii at Hilo with degrees in cultural anthropology and Hawaiian language. It is our goal and koleana to ensure the preservation and perpetuation of Olelo Hawaii, our Hawaiian language, our mother tongue, and culture. Ka ike akamakua he heina ke keiki, a poetic saying that the knowledge of the parents or the elders is caught or uphold by the child. Therefore, it is our koleana to make sure that that transition happens. Naleila mahalo ike ia kono mai. Thank you for this invitation and opportunity to speak.
Mahalo nui e Maka. Let's moving on to Javin.
Hi guys, again, half a day. My name is Javen. Javen Santos. I'm born and raised living in the island of Guam. And I'm also a CAPAL alum. I'm a intern alum from 2017. So I'm really excited to be back working with CAPAL in this capacity as a panelist. So yeah.
Thank you. And then lastly, do we have Lobo online?
No, we do not.
Gotcha. Okay. Moving forward, we're going to dive right in here. So first question we're going to throw out there. What has your journey or experience with America looked like? What does being a Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander in America mean to you? Since I'm the moderator, I'm going to go ahead and call Maka first, since I know him.
I thought Javen was gonna take it. Nah, all good. All right, aloha kako, mahalo for the immediate tag. Growing up in Hawaii and having the background that I did with a grandfather that is a U.S. military veteran was interesting because we grew up and saw the importance, let me use air quotes, quote unquote, importance of that lifestyle and the benefits or support or opportunities of a quote unquote American lifestyle. And going through high school and learning more about my own culture and history has shed a lot of light to the situation, so much so that many of my perspectives that I've had back then have shifted and had a complete 180. I appreciate the multiple perspectives that I've been given or shared and am continuing to learn. In high school, I had the opportunity to go up to Washington, D.C. and serve as a U.S. Senate page for Senator Daniel Akaka. That was very enlightening and a privilege and honor nonetheless, but also added to the multiple perspectives that I'm continuing to learn. And right now, as a Native Hawaiian, we are still in an occupied state. And I'll just go out and say it that we're currently in an illegally occupied state. And we can continue that discussion with the panelists, but I wanted to bring that up and share that that is my opinion, that is my perspective now, and something that we as Native Hawaiians are working towards to rectifying. Speak on it. So recently, 4th of July came and went, and there was a lot of celebrations. As a Native Hawaiian that does not celebrate that quote unquote Independence Day, because we as Kanaka Maoli have our own La Ku'oko'a, or Independence Day, which is November 28th, and our La Ho'i Ho'i'ea, which will be coming up at the end of July. Those two significant dates speak to the return of our sovereignty. And I can give more specific details on that in a moment. But so I guess what I'm trying to say is growing up from pre-high school, high school, and post-high, the opportunities that I've had in the educational realms that I've been given and experiences, many, back and forths and 180s. So mahalo.
Thank you, Maka. And then let's go ahead and get some commentary from Javen.
Thanks. Yeah, so thanks, Maka, for your commentary. And I just wanted to add a little bit to it. This question's a good one, and it's a question that I got the first time I went to CAPAL, because the way that they framed CAPAL in my internship in 2017, what is your experience, I thought was really understanding, because I think in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, a lot of the Asian, if not all the Asian Americans, most of the Asian Americans have some sort of immigrant experience with the United States. And I think me and Maka can both share over the fact that we didn't go to the United States. The United States came to us. So understanding what that meant for us as a Native Hawaii or Pacific Islander in the territory, such as Guam. You know, my experience with the United States is growing up always knowing that I was a US citizen, but not really understanding why my family couldn't vote for president, or why we don't have representatives in the US Congress. And, you know, we're citizens, but we have these certain exceptions that make us second class compared to the rest of the community, or to the rest of the United States out here in the territories. One teacher that I had in middle school social studies class gave this example that really opened my mind to what it means to be specifically a Pacific Islander in the territory, because he asked how many of us in the classroom were born in the United States, in a state, and only maybe one of us or two of us raised our hands. And he said, to the rest of you guys, none of you guys are allowed to run for president someday. There is no enabling you to run for president, because your citizenship is different from the rest of the United States. And so that perspective of what it means to be related to the United States, or to have the United States come to us and not bring us to the same level as they are into the rest of the states, or to, you know, coming to us and not being understanding of our culture and violating our principles, and coming from a place of colonization. You know, it's really an eye-opening perspective, at least from those Pacific Islands that are affiliated with the United States.
Thank you for sharing that. Recently, I was reading our book for our Queen Liliuokalani, and she, after the overthrow, was actually on a train going to Washington, D.C., and she writes in the book, what does America want? They have all this land, vast amount of lands, and why do they want our little garden in the Pacific? I just feel that quote is very pertinent to our discussion today. Going to our next question, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your communities?
So if you can see my background, this is my community. The mountain you see in the back is Ka'ala, and the landscape you see in front of it is the Moku, or district of Waialua. We call it the North Shore. Some might be familiar with Haleiwa on the island of Oahu. That's where I live, that's where I thrive, that's where my community is. COVID shut everything down pretty much. Our economy is unfortunately heavily dependent on tourism, and with the regulations and the closures of travel, you know, cause a ripple effect of businesses and organizations and companies to also shut their doors. We as a community also suffered a few natural disasters during the time, which made it a little harder to get supplies and resources out, but in the same sense, it helped to bring us together and made us stronger. When we noticed, or when we had the fortunate ability to have our spaces back, our beaches and our community back, because of the lack of tourists and the less visitors in our community, we found ways to be more resilient with each other, checking in, whether through Zoom or phone calls or texts, and reaching out to other areas on the island to see how they're doing, coping, maybe to follow or feedback on what they're doing, bring it into our space, or even you know, share with what we're doing, and so that they could build on what their challenges are.
Thank you, Maka. I'm gonna go ahead and ask Michelle to chime in.
Hi, so here in Arkansas, and I just really appreciate everything that all three of you have, brought to light. With Marshallese here in Arkansas, many of us have passed away last year from COVID. It really hit our community really hard. And, I want to say that food insecurity was one of the things that we struggled with. A lot of our families was struggling with rent, not just rent, but like with their income sources. And with multi-generational homes, with a single income earner in the home, that's hard if that person is in quarantine. And it's really important for people to know that we like to take care of our families. We are very family oriented, not just Marshallese, but Pacific Islanders in general. That's our nature, our culture. And I really think that our people rose to the occasion and we're just really resilient, and we supported not just our community, but people outside of our community, because we knew that this is something that's going to hit everybody, not just Marshallese.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing. I was actually going to chime in. We actually had some really awesome ways in Hawaii to get the aid out, but because many of our Pacific Islanders, our Native Hawaiian population live in multi-generational households, the state really struggled with getting the resources out to where it needed to go, because the system of, male, female, wife, husband couldn't be able to get the resources out properly. And so the state really had to revamp the program. Moving on to the next question, I'm going to ask Javan to chime in on this one. Was how has the effects of colonization influenced the experiences of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in the US today? How has the developments and events before colonization influenced the experiences of the NHPI communities?
Yeah, so I'll speak to my experience in Guam and some of my work that I've done in the broader Pacific Islander community as well. Last summer during the pandemic, I was a research assistant to Guam's Commission on Decolonization. It's a government organization that seeks to affirm the rights of decolonization to the indigenous people of Guam, the Chamorro people. And so our study was done just to look at the potential realities of what a decolonized Guam could look like and the steps that we would take to decolonize. And when we talk about the effects of colonization today, we have to look at the way that many of the things that I mentioned in the polls, why do Pacific Islanders have such a high rate of going into the military? Why are so many Pacific Islanders displaced from their homeland? A lot of it has to do with the way that colonization affected opportunity in these Pacific Islands. Tourism is not sustainable. This pandemic showed us that tourism is not sustainable. Guam and Hawaii, these economies are suffering because of its reliance on the tourism economy. And this tourism economy has been propped up by the limited opportunities that Pacific Islanders have due to colonization, and so the research that I did with the Commission of Decolonization, it all concluded that in Guam's case, any status change for our territory, whether we choose statehood, free association, or independence, would be better than our current colonial status of being a US territory, where we don't get certain rights and where there are several federal policies like the Jones Act that really hamper our political and economic self-sustainability, So, it's a struggle to figure out how the best way is to decolonize here in Guam, because there's a sizable indigenous population, but there's also a sizable settler population as well, you know, and the conversation then becomes, do settlers who came to Guam because it was colonized by the United States, who lived here, do they have a right to decolonize too? And that conversation is something that's very difficult to have in Guam, especially because indigenous peoples have internationally granted rights to self-determination. So it gets complicated because of the US's relationship to Guam, that right to decolonization. So yeah, colonization has impacted Guam specifically and many of the other territories very difficultly, but ultimately our research concluded that any status change is better than our current territorial status.
Thank you for sharing. Does any of our other panelists want to chime in briefly on this heavy question?
I don't know about briefly, but if you don't mind.
Please go.
Okay, Ikino, mahalo. So congratulations, Rep. Branco, for being the first Native Hawaiian on the CAPAL board. Is that correct? Is that what I heard correctly? Okay, awesome. Again, this is my first time engaging with CAPAL, and I appreciate the openness and the opportunity to share. So I'm going to share some stuff. 1778, Captain Cook was the first European to make contact with the Hawaiian Islands. And then, you know, with his contact came disease and trade and exploration. King Kamehameha I, Kamehameha Ekahi, united the islands in 1810. I'm giving you some dates, and there's a lot of stuff in between, but just to show you or share with you a brief background. First missionaries arrived in Hawaii in 1820. With 1820 and the arrival of missionaries, our economy and land use is diversifying. And so we have the first sugar plantation opened up on Kauai, the island of Kauai, in 1835. With the plantation and monocropping growing, we needed more labor force. So in the 1850s, first workers were recruited from China, and then from Japan, Korea, Philippines, and Portugal. In 1882, so mind you, we're still a kingdom, okay? In 1882, the Iolani Palace, the official residence of the Hawaiian monarchs, is completed. The palace was ahead of its time and outfitted with the most up-to-date amenities such as electric and indoor plumbing and telephone, okay? 1887, Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom is stripping King Kalakaua's status, and it becomes known as the Bayonet Constitution. So 1887, we're already seeing a change because of the influence of missionaries and the plantation owners and the businessmen. 1893, overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom begins. Queen Liliuokalani is placed under house arrest at Iolani Palace. You know, the palace that just had all those amenities? Yeah, placed under house arrest. 1896, teaching and learning through Olelo Hawaii, our Hawaiian language, our native tongue, is banned in public schools. 1898, Hawaii is annexed by the United States through the Newlands Resolution. In 1900, the Organic Act establishes the territory of Hawaii. So all of this is happening. Our people are losing their language, are banned from speaking the language, learning the language. Culture is being diminished because we're working and we're doing manual labor that we're not accustomed to. In essence, our Native Hawaiian independence was stolen by the United States of America. And as I mentioned, that's my opinion, it's my perspective. It's also a fact confirmed by US government. And so recently I saw a quote by Dr. Alfred Desaias of the UN United Nations as an independent expert from the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, CEOs. I've come to understand that the lawful political status of the Hawaiian Islands is that of a sovereign nation state in continuity, but a nation state that is under a strange form of occupation by the United States resulting from an illegal military occupation and a fraudulent annexation. So that's where we're at. And the effects of colonization are ongoing. Right now, Rep. Bronco is in DC celebrating 100 years of Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana Ole's act that he made in legislation, the federal government, for the benefit of our Hawaiian people. As we're going through all of that turmoil, transition, and pretty much the loss of land and access to land, Prince Kuhio, as a delegate, went up to make sure that we still had connection to Aina, or place, or land. And I think the next couple questions will allow me to share a little bit more. So mahalo.
Mahalo Maka for sharing our history. I wanted to give Michelle the opportunity to chime in if she wanted to, or we can move on to the next question.
I'm sorry, the question?
How has the effects of colonization influenced the experiences of Pacific Islanders today? And how have the developments and events before colonization affected Pacific Islanders today as well?
Oh, that is a really good question. So here for Marshallese, oh gosh, I would say everything from the way we carry ourselves, our language, our livelihood. It has impacted everything that we do and the way we live. For example, the way when people talk about wealth, we don't consider wealth as in money. We consider wealth as in family, as in resources, like the food that we have in the ocean, the people that we carry with us, our ancestors, our history, our culture, everything that we carry is considered wealthy, but not money. And I want to say for colonization, it took away a lot of that from us, and just the way we look at ourselves now. Everything, when you come back to history, the World War II, the bombing, the nuclear, our nuclear legacy, it's killing us. We are a dying breed, and we're trying to preserve our culture. We're trying to preserve our bloodline. And I think if we can do the things that we can to preserve it, it's going to be really harder now because most of our elders have died off.
Thank you to all of you for sharing. We do have some very, very heavy history, but let's continue on the conversation. Moving on, what is generational trauma, and how has that affected you and or your community?
I could talk about that. Generational trauma. In terms of Marshall, we have a lot of generational trauma, and I don't mean to laugh at that or to play it down. I think it all ties back to World War II, to our nuclear legacy, and it's the way we express our grief, even unexpressed grief. We are still grieving our homeland. We're still grieving our culture. We're still grieving our ancestors, and everything that we're learning now is we're trying to bring back those memories and all the things that we hold near and dear. So generational trauma in that respect, and then climate change. we see that our islands are sinking, and if everything's connects back to land, and how we share and serve our people is through our land rights, and that's our livelihood, our love for one another is through land and through our people.
Maka or Javon, please. Javon.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about when people in Guam or many of the other Pacific Islands think about generational trauma, we think about the impacts World War II had in the Pacific. The Pacific theater during World War II was devastating to Hawaii, devastating to many of the other Pacific Islanders. What a lot of people don't know is, at least about Guam, is that on the way back from bombing Pearl Harbor in World War II, on the way back to Japan, you pass by Guam, and that same day, it was December 8th, Guam time, and that was our patron saint of Guam's observation day. So many people were in church that day, and that was when the bombs hit Guam. And that devastated our island. And then the Japanese occupation of Guam during World War II was also devastating to our people. And in terms of generational trauma, I think about how I'm still trying to relearn my language, because the Chamorro people have literally been beaten up for speaking their language by the Japanese occupation or by the American occupation. So yeah, generational trauma comes with a lot of shame for the Pacific Islander people, just struggling to survive. And so when we talk about generational trauma, we talk about how to heal from these impacts that colonization have had on our people, whether it be through environment, whether it be through loss of land, whether it be through loss of culture, and really trying to learn as much as we can from our elders in our communities in order to preserve what has been left, preserve what we have left of our culture and our people. So thinking about generational trauma is thinking about the impacts that history has had on our elders in our community, and how we can build back our culture and our people better from that.
Thank you. Maka, if you want to chime in.
Mahalo. Trauma is such a familiar word to us as Indigenous and cultural folk. So I mentioned, Captain James Cook being the first European. And so from that point on, colonization started, privatization of land, economic shifts, introduction of new religions, collapse of the family system. We were living in an ahupua'a system, in kauhale system, in systems that allowed us to thrive pre-colonization, colonization, and then the effects of all of that and the trauma, including, as Javen mentioned, loss of language, loss of land, loss of belief systems, unsafe environments, limitations to human, natural, and financial resources. As Michelle mentioned, our wealth in Hawaiian, it's called vai, is not monetary. It's your natural resources. It's water, it's land, access to food. And so trauma, illness, death, abuse, racism, loss of cultural identity, leading to, risk factors, high social stress, no emotional support, feelings of hopelessness, inaccessibility to traditional healings such as ho'oponopono, conflict resolution, la'au lapa'au, medicinal herbs, lomi, massage, and then the negative health outcomes. Right now, we're struggling with mental health and substance abuse. depression, anxiety, domestic abuse, obesity, and chronic diseases. It's rampant in our communities. Why? All the way back to that very first day that I mentioned, 1778. And, you know, we're not, there are some that are dwelling in that. Our goal is to pull out of that space and heal each other. How do we heal? We talk about it, move forward, find ways to fight the system or bridge the gaps and the inaccessibilities or the inequalities. Find ways to have the conversation, the difficult conversations, and pull us out of it collectively.
Mahalo for those powerful words. Moving on to the next question. Have you ever felt that Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders have been tokenized? If you can share the context, and where do you think the tokenization stems from?
I can start on that. Just talking from my experience being a part of the AAPI community in DC, I've worked with CAPAL and Apex and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and it's really interesting to see how Asian American AAPI organizations interact with the Pacific Islander community, because it seems like a lot of the community, you know, definitely in terms of portion, there's more Asian Americans in the US than Pacific Islanders, but it seems like a lot of the community is not really aware of our inclusion in that community, or is confused about what the AAPI community is and where it comes from. You know, from my understanding, the AAPI community comes from a point in time where Asian Americans were aggregated with Pacific Islanders in the census data. And now at this point, a lot of us are having conversations of whether or not this AANHPI or AAPI label is still suitable for our communities. But in terms of tokenization, a lot of times being the only Pacific Islander in these youth public service or youth advocacy perspectives is difficult and feels tokenizing, because the eye is on you on these certain issues. And I'm not saying that as a fault to these organizations. It's just a reality of trying to figure out how best do these organizations serve the Pacific Islander community. You know, I think that it's difficult to serve the Pacific Islander community if we're not represented in these types of programming. And I think by being more inclusive in programming and providing opportunities like this as a platform for us to start conversations and educate the AAPI community on the PI, on the NHPI and the AANHPI community, is a good way to prevent this tokenization and prevent all these expectations from falling on the one Samoan intern or the one Hawaiian intern that gets selected to be a part of the cohort. But yeah, that's my experience on that.
Thank you for sharing. Any of the other panelists?
Okay, so I really do feel like, Javon, you said you are on point on everything. And, you know, especially being a Micronesian in the Pacific Islander domain, it's kind of hard to separate us from Polynesians, because most of the times people are just looking to Pacific Islanders, and with citizens of COFA, we're always left behind. We feel like we're at the bottom when it comes to Pacific Islanders. And me being Asian, also Pacific Islander, in my blood, I feel like I can't separate the two, but I also need to, because with data, it's so important. And I feel like data is such a big, impactful word because you can do a lot with it. And in the right context, you can do so many things positive for your community. But in a negative way, it can be hurtful and turn against your community. And for me being Marshallese and Pacific Islander, we're always looked at as okay, for example, nuclear legacy. Let's put a Marshallese up there. What about the other Kofa nations, like the other people, other Micronesians who were impacted by it? We also need to look at not just Marshallese, but other Micronesians, other Pacific Islanders, other people who were impacted by nuclear bombs, nuclear testing, nuclear experiments. Because we cherish and we keep our relationships with people sacred, that's what we need to do, is build those relationships and keep those people close to us, because you never know what knowledge they have and hold. And that's another prosperity or of wealth, is knowledge of your elders.
I just wanted to add a little bit to the conversation and talk about, when Michelle's talked about being Micronesian, I can definitely understand, how even within Pacific Islander spaces, it's hard for Micronesians to find space, and Melanesians as well. One example that I just wanted to give really quick is that when I had interned in Congress at the American Samoa's office, and the two other interns were American Samoan, and this conversation, or this quick interaction, like really stood out to me, just on how Polynesians interact with Micronesians, because these two Samoans, the girl was 5'9" and the guy was 6 feet, and I'm 5'6" on a good day. So we were in the elevator together, and they looked to me and they were like, we're very Polynesian and you're very Micronesian. And so just reacting to that in the best way possible, I think, like, talking about making space for Micronesians and Melanesians in these spaces definitely avoids the tokenization and the issues that come with that.
Maka, do you want to add, or you want to go on to the next question?
I'll briefly add something and drop something into the chat for our audience. Recently, we had a very influential Kanaka pass away, and much of her teachings live on in her students and her family, Dr. Haunani K. Trask. So I read this and share with you. Burdened with the commodification of our culture and exploitation of our people, Hawaiians exist in an occupied country whose hostage people are forced to witness, and for many to participate in, for our own collective humiliation as tourist artifacts for the first world. So this was written back in 1991 and 1992. Lovely hula hands. And I'm gonna share the link for everyone to be able to access the article. It talks about, or in my perspective, when you have a Hawaiian in the room and they're Hawaiian, I use air quotes, like, oh, you can dance hula, or you can do the cultural thing, right? And that's not always the case. And so I'll leave it at that. The opportunity to learn more and expand our knowledge collectively, as Michelle and Javen mentioned, of all AA and HPI advocates. So mahalo.
Thank you. Moving on to our next question. What circumstances such as territorial status, statehood, and voting regulations have on your community? Where do these regulations stem from? What changes need to be Let's go ahead and start with Michelle, if you don't mind.
Oh my gosh. Again, it affects us how we serve our community and how we serve it well. I think most of the work, the legwork, footwork is done by the community. And if our policymakers are not listening to our community and having people from our community represent our community, it's going to impact us really hard, especially when it comes to voting. And, it's really hard to stay relevant and be innovative and still be rooted in your culture.
Maka, if you wanna jump in on this one.
I'll
J-Man, it's all
talk
you then.
to a little bit about it. When we talk about like federal policy, I talked a lot about colonization and territorial status. And to me, the solution is giving the choice back to the people, giving the choice back to the indigenous people of Guam, to the indigenous people of Hawaii to make their choices. And decide for themselves what they want the future of their home federal policy that affect the community. I just wanted to bring up a point that in 2018, when they were talking about the census and the citizenship question, when I was in Asian American spaces, I brought up the COFA migrants and the fact that a lot of COFA migrants from the Marianas Islands, from the Micronesian Islands are not citizens. So when the citizenship question came up, I asked the organization, I was like, how do COFA migrants answer these questions? And they were like, I don't know too. So thank goodness that question wasn't on thank goodness the question wasn't on the census, but talking about how we recognize these types of federal policies and going to those communities and saying, hey, this is a policy that's happening. How does it affect you? And directly engaging with us as the Pacific Islander community will help us figure out the best ways to deal with these policy decisions ourselves.
I changed my mind. I'm gonna jump in.
Okay, jump in briefly.
Land back.
Your time.
Kako'o supporting land back. That's get our people back on the land, access to land, access to resources, so that we can build back and fill in the gaps that we've missed for many generations. So super stoked, and you got to meet her, so I'm kind of jealous. But U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, the first Native American to head a cabinet agency, struggled to contain her emotions on, when was it? Last month, when there was an imminent transfer of 80 acres of excess federal lands to a trust for Native Hawaiians. Now, 80 acres, some might think that's not enough. Agreed. But it's something, right? It's a step in a direction. And so as she continued to reflect on that, she said, since that time, our country has learned a great deal. And now we're in an era where we recognize the importance of healing the generational traumas that caused pain and heartache. I'm stoked to have an Indigenous woman in that seat, in that space. And us as Native Hawaiians are on the side of, land back. We're in an occupied state, we're in an occupied country. And wouldn't that be great to have our kingdom?
Moving on to our last question. What is your experience in broader Asian American spaces? Umbrella term AANHPI/AAPI, hashtag stop AAPI hate. How can Asian Americans be allies to the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community?
I could give it a go and start by just talking about my experience in Pacific Islander spaces and in Asian American spaces. There's been, I'm not sure if everyone else here has seen it, but at least from my perspective, I've seen a lot of discussion of whether the AANHPI label still serves to benefit the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. And I've seen a lot of discussion of what does the Pacific Islanders benefit from in these conversations. You know, I think one of the things that opened my eyes in terms of being involved with the AAPI community is how different the Asian American community is from the Pacific Islander community. I think about one of the issues that I learned about the Asian American community is the model minority myth, and how there is this perceived model minority expectation of Asian Americans. And, you know, Pacific Islanders don't get that perceived expectation of being a model minority. Not to say that it's a good thing, but, you know, the perspective of Pacific Islanders is not the way that the American community views Asian Americans is really different than the way the American community observes Pacific Islanders, if they observe Pacific Islanders at all. So talking about what the Asian American community can do to be allies to the Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islander communities, I would say let them have their space to talk and listen. As Asian Americans who are, especially the Asian Americans being the largest portion of the AA and HPI community, please listen to the Pacific Islander community, listen to their concerns, and even if some of it affects your livelihoods, like for example, decolonization of the Pacific Islands that many Asian Americans live in, even if it affects you, please listen and try to understand where they're coming from. And having a conversation with the Pacific Islander community and respecting our beliefs and our culture and our values will go so far in being allies to us as the Native Hawaiian and the Pacific Islander community.
Michelle?
Sorry, I had trouble trying to unmute myself, but yeah, Jevin, oh my gosh, I love that. Thank you so much. You answered most of what I was gonna say. And I wanted to bring up this one TikToker who was sharing, you know, Native Hawaiians, you know, beautiful spaces that were just for locals. And she didn't think there was a problem with that because she had a friend who was born in Hawaii. And, you know, we want to protect our lands. We want to preserve our people and our communities. Yes, please listen to us. Listen to what we have to say and what's coming from our hearts. It's not to hurt people. It's to preserve people and actually preserve our lands. Give us that space to, you know, continue to love on each other and to give each other the respect that it deserves. I think most of the times I feel invisible in Asian American spaces and even in Pacific Islander spaces, just because I'm Marshallese and just because I come from a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean does not make me invisible. We are here because of national security, and you know, freedom is not free. And we are here because your history needs to be shared and it needs to be in history books. So please learn about history, please learn about culture, learn about each other, especially about us.
Thank you for those powerful words. Maka, if you want to go ahead and close.
Was that the last question?
Yes.
I'm gonna piggyback that question with the anonymous question in the Q&As about Asian settler colonialism, and coming to the islands to alleviate these effects. Yes, and yes, and everything that Javen said and Michelle echoed. I think the expectation is if you're coming into a foreign space that you're not familiar with, or you have no cultural, genealogical, historical ties, come in with an open mind and open, as we say in Hawaii, na'au, ready to learn and ready to huli kalima ilalo, turn your hands down and work. Not coming into a space with your hands open, like you're receiving, you know, all the goodness of the aina or the land. No, make like the residents, make like the community, make like the indigenous, and work with us. Through that work, you'll learn. Makahanaka ike. That's what I end with. Mahalo.
Before I turn it over to Dakota for the Q&A session, I just want to say how powerful this is. When I was on the board, we talked just about having a general primer for our other communities to learn about Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, because our issues are very different and very unique. And so thank you folks for all of you who participated to sharing our perspectives and sharing your voice. And this is just very powerful, and I can't thank you enough. I'm going to log off now, but I'm handing it over to Dakota, and he's going to take it over for the Q&A.
No worries. Thank you, Representative Branco, and thank you for attending today. I know you have an insanely busy schedule, so thanks for taking the time to speak with us and moderate this panel. And yeah, I can go ahead and get us started on the Q&A. And yeah, Patrick, feel free to stick around for as long as you can. If you want to answer some of the questions, you can. If not, feel free to go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. And so we have a number of questions lined up in the Q&A, and I'll just kind of take them in order and read out who had posted them, as well as kind of maybe putting it over to one of our amazing panelists to go over. But this first question is for Vanessa, from Vanessa Tufaga, sorry. In what ways should the Pacific diaspora prepare for the damage that climate change is doing to our home islands? And so I don't know if anyone wants to take a first stab at this, but I will go based on whoever's making the most eye contact. Don't blink. So Michelle, do you want to take a first stab at this?
Sure. I think science is really important. Being innovative and just really being open-minded, like Maka said, and sharing in our culture, preserving our ways in how we did it back then with our ancestors, giving our land the freedom, not freedom, but like giving our land, our land back to itself, where it can heal itself, is like healing ourselves. So we need science, and we need innovative people to help us with climate change, and not just us and science, but you know, the big people who are causing climate change, like the oil riggers and, you know, companies who, you know, dump waste, and tourism. We need solutions that will help our land heal.
Yeah, totally agree. I think, yeah, go ahead, Siobhan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, when we're talking about climate change, you know, as someone who also works in the climate advocacy circles, you know, I would say to look at the contributors to climate change, and, you know, advocating for change, you know, being a part of the United States, being in the US, one of the biggest contributors to climate change, advocating to your community and to your country to stop emitting carbon emissions, you know, advocating to the US will have beneficial impacts on climate change in the Pacific. I know that a lot of just for perspective, I know that there are islands in the Marshall Islands that are being built up with cement in order to prevent them from sinking, because different geography of different islands, but a lot of the Marshall Islands is low-lying atolls. So understanding how how climate change affects the Pacific Islands and advocating to the larger countries and to the international community to make change, and learning about what's at stake, like islands literally sinking, and using that and fueling your advocacy with that is a great way to help the community back here in the islands to help mitigate that climate change, because Pacific Islanders are not the biggest contributors to climate change, but they are the ones that are having the most to lose.
Yeah, for sure. And I just saw in the chat, Maka, I know you have to go as well. So we're spending so many different time zones here. So I just wanted to see if you wanted to give an answer to the question too before you have to go, or before we let you go.
No, I think that you folks covered it. I did provide my email address to Hannah and you folks. Feel free to share it with any of our audience members that have any specific questions. I do appreciate, again, this time and space. I call on my apologies that I did need to jump off. So here I'll say ahuiho, mahalo.
Thank you so much for joining us, and take care. Yeah, thank you for that, Javon. And we have a couple more questions, and I think these are primarily directly to you and Michelle, so this actually works out pretty well. But the next question, which was submitted by an anonymous attendee, was, how do you feel about mainstream PI representation like The Rock and Moana? Are these stereotypes that are perpetuated when PI communities come into the public eye? So yeah, we already got an UG, so this should be interesting. But do either of you want to give your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I could get started. When we think about, I think The Rock is a good example of leaning on tokenizing for a career, because we see The Rock continues to lean on his American Samoan roots and be a proud advocate to the American Samoan community and the Pacific Islander community. But at the same time, the conversation becomes less and less about his African American or his Black ancestry as well. And, understanding the spaces you're in are important. But I'm not sure how many Pacific Islanders or many of the Black community see The Rock as part of his own. But I do know that The Rock has been heavily involved and has made a career of, playing Moana or playing in Moana and playing in Hobbs and Shaw, leaning on his Samoan ancestry. So when we talk about Moana, and even Lilo and Stitch is a good example too of how orientalized and exoticized Pacific Islander cultures are, and seen as either different or seen as ancient and something of the past. But there are still Pacific Islanders here today, and I think it's important for us to look at what Pacific Islanders today look like, and it's very hard to see representation of us in the media today. It's always, this is based on Pacific Islanders from a long time ago. And me and Michelle can both attest to this. It's oftentimes Polynesians. But that's all I'll say to that.
Javen, I love you so much. All of your answers are just, I'm just going to say ditto. Ditto to all of it. Because like Moana, I feel like it was just Polynesian culture. And just in that space, yes, I am proud to be not Polynesian, but Pacific Islander. Yes, I'm proud that, it showed a culture, a side of us that's not really represented. But in a way, disappointed we're always going to be tokenized in that respect. But in a way, I'm also, I feel humbled at the same time. So I have mixed emotions. The Rock, yeah, he's Samoan and he's Polynesian. And I think the way to stay rooted is to always come back to, who you are and come back to your people and say, hey, if I did something wrong, if I represented us wrong, let me know, because I want to show the world who we really are.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michelle. Yeah, I definitely see where that sense
One thing I just wanted to add really quick, when we're talking about Moana, is an interesting fact about Moana is that Polynesians are seen as the voyagers and the trekking across the Pacific. But at some point in time, the Polynesians had stopped voyaging and the Micronesians had retaught them how to voyage and how to travel the Pacific with their visits and their learning. So Moana being a great representation, a lot of their voyaging was inspired by Micronesian culture that is still practiced today. So that's just something I wanted to add. I'm so sorry for interrupting.
You're totally fine. I mean, this space is for you panelists, so I'm just asking questions here, and these are, I think, great points and great responses. So thank you for that. And, we are running slightly low on time and we're now starting to get a steamroll of questions, but I think we'll try and cap it off with this one for you, Michelle. This was submitted to Michelle's earlier points. Do you feel that those of us with Asian and Pacific Island heritage need to emphasize our NHPI-ness over our AA-ness as the more marginalized minority community? And how do you think about this kind of code switching for, thinking about our very cultural heritage?
That is such a really loaded question. I mean, but it's a really good question, right? Because I come from Japanese ancestors, but I also come from Micronesia background. So I really think it all stems to your connection with your roots. It's really important to be, where you fit in, because like most of the times you don't feel like you belong, especially if you're Asian American or Pacific Islander American, Marshallese American. It's really hard to say where you fit in, but if you're connected to each aspect of your roots, your people, you're not going to represent one more than the other, because you're going to be representing both. And for me, I'm so proud of my grandparents, my great grandparents, who are Japanese, Gilbertese, Micronesian, and now me being all of those and American. I can say I am proud to be a descendant of them, and just speaking on what they wanted for me and my future.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. And yeah, well, I thought we'd be out of time, but we actually have a few more minutes, and there's a very, I'll cap it when it's time, but there's a spicy question sitting here in the Q&A that I think I will also address, if that's okay. And it is, how are you feeling about the increased hordes of tourism and modern day colonization during the pandemic to your islands? Especially Hawaii. Hawaii is given as the example where water use is restricted to locals but are not for visitors and hotels, and the privatization of public beaches with gates by white gentrifiers. So pretty pointed, and I think it would have been nice to have our other two panelists and moderator comment on this too from the Hawaii perspective, but go for it. You got a few minutes left.
Yeah, I wish they were here to talk more about the Hawaiian perspective, but I can talk from Guam's perspective. Guam is actually a huge tourism hub in the Pacific as well. The continental is pretty far, so that's not really our market, but we get millions of Japanese and Korean and Russian tourists coming to Guam every day. And we think about how tourism is our industry in Guam. A lot of the reason why is because federal policies have limited the amount of options we have for our economy. Guam used to do so much before tourism. Guam used to export copra. Guam used to have garment manufacturing. Guam used to have various different industries, but whenever an industry became successful, the federal government either placed tariffs or enacted policies that hurt the industry and have whittled down our options to where tourism is the most viable. And thinking about who benefits from the tourism, the foreign-owned corporations who plant their hotels on our island. I'll say this, I am descended from Tautotomhom, a village in Guam that is currently occupied entirely by the tourism industry. So my family has been displaced from our native village because of the tourism industry. So thinking about how tourism is an industry that is low paying, that benefits a lot of the foreign companies more so than it does the local community, and how it was whittled down from a lot of options. I think, at least here in Guam's experience, that's the history and why it's so important that part of decolonization is economic diversification, at least in Guam, because if we are able to decolonize, all these options that were whittled down from federal policy are reopened to us. So thinking about how tourism has been so perpetuated in the Pacific and who it benefits is important to understanding this question and understanding, how tourism impacts our communities.
Michelle, any closing thoughts?
Ditto, but I can only speak to Marshall Island. I would add military, how it's based on Quaj, and with all the resources, most of the resources going to Quaj, the military base, there's the island next to it called Ibai, and they call it the slum of Marshall Islands because it's so overcrowded, and everything, just like Javen said, we have to decolonize and think of colonization and how it impacted our islands and just our way of life. And so military, I think, is also part of that.
For sure. And yeah, thank you so much for the thoughtful answers to this last surprise question too. And there is one more question kind of in the Q&A section right now that I'm hoping that, I'm going to give some closing remarks. And while I'm doing that, you can maybe type out some answers for this attendee and our remaining attendees. But the last question was, are there any NH or PI organizations you would like us to know and support? And so, feel free to type out some answers and drop them in the chat for folks. I think that'd be good for people to see. But I'm going to go ahead and close and say thank you to Javan, Michelle, and also to Maka and Patrick for this thoughtful conversation. I definitely learned a lot, and all of our attendees probably did as well. And just thank you for joining us today. This was an effort to get everyone connected across all these different time zones and in the same space to share that space, but it worked out. And so before everyone logs off, there's just a few more important pieces of information that I'd like to go over. So first, CAPAL still has events planned for this summer, and next Wednesday we have our final WLP session, Our Voice, Our Power, NHPI Cross-Community Alignment, where we're going to be addressing topics surrounding the NHPI community and its alignment in terms of providing solidarity and building cross-community connections outside of the ANHPI realm. So this will be, I think, a very interesting session and a very also spicy session with lots of opinions. But the key topics that we will include include NHPI involvement, perspective of recent social movements and events, the repercussions of the complexity of the ANHPI community, and how that translates to the actual cross-community alignment we're going to be discussing, and the ways in which we can move forward to build productive dialogue and bridges. So please check out our website to figure out how to register and to view all our upcoming programming. Our website again is CAPAL.org, and then you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hashtag is @CAPALDC, or find us on LinkedIn. And so, I'd also like to take this moment to thank all of our 2021 sponsors for their continued support in our programs and helping us to provide opportunities for NHPI youth and public service. As a quick aside, CAPAL, for those of you who didn't know, was initially an all-volunteer organization that has served more than 600 scholars and interns and awarded over $360,000 to support public service careers for both undergraduate and graduate students. Our board members, scholars, and interns have gone on to serve as senior leaders across government, as you just saw in Representative Branco, from executive, legislative, and judicial branches to federal, state, and local levels, and prominent policy and advocacy organizations. And so your valued financial contributions help expand this work. If you would like to donate, please also visit CAPAL.org. And please spread the word about our scholarship and internship program. We have opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students open every year in November. And if there are any NHPI students that you know, organizations that might be interested, please tell them about us. And if your organization is interested in sponsoring us, please reach out to our managing director, Shama Ahmad, for sponsorship opportunities. And finally, we're always trying to improve our programming to meet the needs and expectations of our community. So there's a short survey linked in the chat that should take you no more than 2 or 3 minutes to complete. Your honest feedback will be extremely valuable to our future programming, and your contribution is much appreciated. And with